Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Let's Talk About It webinar. I'm Leslie Viscara-Cherney. I am the Vice President of Operations and Patient Navigator for the chapter. I am with the Lupus Foundation of America Greater Ohio chapter, and I want to thank all of you for joining us. Each month, our chapter network presents a webinar on important topics related to lupus from experts across the country. Tonight, we will be learning about lupus and understanding environmental triggers. But before I introduce tonight's host, I want to remind you that the information provided in this webinar is for general information and educational purposes only, and it is not in substitute for your physician's advice. The views expressed in our webinar and partners are those of the presenters and not necessarily the view of the Lupus Foundation of America. And then also all lines have been muted to provide a distraction-free learning environment. If you have questions during the webinar, please type them in the chat box and our presenter will try to get as many questions as possible. If you have further questions or want to learn more about upcoming educational programs, support groups, events in your area, please reach out to your local chapter. So here we go, my next slide. This evening presenting is Dr. Maria Antonelli. She's a board certified rheumatologist in the Division of Rheumatology at Case Western Reserve University Department of Medicine at MetroHealth Medical Center in Cleveland, Ohio. She completed her residency in Cleveland. She's done her fellowship and serves as chief resident. She's also the assistant professor of medicine at Case Western Reserve University and is passionate about training fellows and residents. She has a special interest in lupus and will focus her presentation tonight on understanding lupus environmental triggers. The goal is to provide a better understanding on the topic and how to live well with lupus. So thanks, Dr. Antonelli. Sorry, I butchered your intro a little bit. But if you could go ahead and grab that screen and pull up your presentation, we can get going. And take your time. I know the settings sometimes are difficult for me.
No, it's all good. It's all good. Can you see my screen, Leslie?
Beautiful, yes.
All right. Thanks for that nice introduction, Leslie. And thank you everybody for having me and joining us today. As Leslie said, I'm Maria Antonelli from Cleveland, where Leslie and I are here in about 3 feet of snow in the last week. Speaking of environments, so today we are going to be covering the topic of, and I'm going to try to minimize this, hopefully not cover any of the screen. We're going to be covering today environmental influences on lupus development, lupus disease activity, and try to summarize changes that a person with lupus could make to positively affect their environment and their lupus. All right, I'm going to start off with this. I love this picture and this study. Whenever reading about lupus and environmental triggers, there's always a mention of this study where they looked at a population of lupus patients and compared to a control population, so a group who do not have lupus, and looked at pets and then looked specifically at lupus in dogs. And so there was a slight but significantly higher prevalence of lupus in dog pets of patients with lupus in comparison to those who did not have lupus. And this study basically suggests that there's a common environmental factor for both the human and dog systemic lupus. And here the picture, you can see the former First Lady Barbara Bush with her dog Millie, who was one of the most famous dog lupus patients, and both former President Bush Sr. and Barbara both had autoimmune thyroid disease. So not perfect for that study, but suggestive. All right, so when I was asked to do this topic, I kind of made a list of things that I commonly think about as environmental risk factors for kind of anything. And so we're going to try to cover each of these in a little bit more or less detail. I would first off say, in general, looking at environmental things in general are very difficult to study because you're trying to tease out a single variable in comparison to looking at all the things as a whole. But first, I wanted to make a mention of basically there's a very big interplay between genetics and the environment and the development of lupus, in addition to lupus disease activity. So we often talk about something called the two-hit hypothesis. So we think about this, that persons who are genetically predisposed to both lupus or other autoimmune diseases have certain genes that they've gotten down from their parents that put them in a position that they might eventually develop some autoimmune disease, and that there's something in the environment, whether it be in the diet, the sun, smoking, infections, etc., that lead to immune changes that lead to that condition, that autoimmune condition. But really, it's not a two-hit only. It's more of a 3 or a 4-hit, right? Because you get that first hit, genetic, then you get your environmental trigger or whatever else that might trigger that autoimmune disease. And then you also have kind of a feedback loop, because once you have lupus, it's not the end of the story. You continue to eat or maybe continue to smoke and live under the sun, continue to have infections and things like that. So it's really kind of like many loops going back and forth here. So the first topic we're going to cover is diet. And in general, this is one that is very difficult to study because it's very hard to put patients in a lab and say you're only allowed to eat X, Y, and Z, right? Nobody wants to do that. Nobody wants to sign up for that. And even if we did, it would be for a very short period of time. It's very hard to control diet for longer than maybe a couple of weeks. In general, there's no evidence that diet plays a role in lupus development. The only very, very small conflicting studies were regarding alfalfa sprout consumption. But as I said, they're conflicting studies. So some that suggested that there was a possible role for lupus development. However, other studies that negated that finding. There were no associations between risk of developing lupus and antioxidant intakes. Those are the things that are in the fancy superfoods, but again, no association. And then also not enough investigation into foods and chemicals in foods or dietary supplements that are associated with risk or disease course for lupus. Now, one thing that we do know is that lupus patients suffer disproportionately from cardiovascular disease. And so that would be like heart attacks, strokes, things like that. So because of that, what are some things that you can do to positively affect your diet for lupus patients? We know that diet can affect both blood pressure and cholesterol, which are the very, very important parts of cardiac risk factors. So focusing on a lower fat diet and avoiding things like saturated fats, avoiding trans fats like margarines, avoiding heavy animal products like cholesterols and meat products, and then trying to adhere to a lower sodium diet and avoiding things like adding table salt and having heavily processed foods like canned foods, deli meats, pre-prepared things, which usually use salt as a preservative. So we know what you can't eat, so what should you eat? So things that are heavy in the whole grains, so less processing, like less bleached flours, good sources of energy like vegetables, lean sources of protein, if protein is coming from an animal product, nuts, good fats, including olive oils and avocados. And you know what goes with diet, exercise. So trying to exercise for up to at least 30 minutes daily. And the best evidence here we have is things like low impact daily activities like walking, biking, yoga, swimming, Tai Chi, stretching activities, things like that. Then moving on to the next environmental influence, I kind of lump them all together: minerals, chemicals, pesticides, pollutants. And these are things that, you know, there's chemicals all around us. We are all made up of chemicals, but studying these things where you're kind of focusing on one particular chemical is usually very difficult. So these couple of examples here are from very high exposure to certain chemicals. So the first example, things like higher exposure to silica. So this is very well clearly delineated in the literature that high exposure to silica leads to an increased risk of developing lupus. And so we know that from particular studies where looking at persons who did sandblasting or granite cutting, cement processing, bricklaying, things like that. Another example with where there's high silica exposure is like that there are some new studies in the last several years looking at autoimmune conditions after 9/11 first responders. So like the firefighters and police and so on who were exposed to that high silica level in the 9/11 terrorist attacks. The second mineral exposure, it would be mercury. So mercury exposure possibly is related to lupus development. And this came from a study that looked at leaded glass hobbyists. So like the really pretty stained glass, where if you do that as like a hobby, there is high levels of mercury in the lead, in the leading. And so it is more common to find lupus patients who are leaded glass hobbyists. So that's where we get this suggestion. And then also pesticide exposure. So both mixing and applying are possibly linked, although it's not very clear to lupus development, although there's no data on lupus flares. Now, air pollution, this one is very important, and it was going to come up several times throughout the studies that we're going to present today. So there's definitely some suggestion of increased risk of all autoimmune rheumatic disease, but very difficult to study as a whole. When you're looking particularly at lupus disease flares, there was a study out of, I think this one was out of Johns Hopkins, where there's a very big lupus cohort that looked and found a correlation between the fine particulate matter, so PM 2.5. And so this is looking at very, very, very fine particulate matter. And I was just looking this up before, and of course it escapes me now, but basically it's stuff that you cannot see with the naked eye. Like at the dot at the end of in that 2.5, that little dot has, thousands and thousands of 2.5 PMs. So the higher the concentration of this particulate matter in the environment, so on a day where the pollution is very, very high, the higher the pollution, the more association with risks of lupus flares, in particularly skin flares, joint flares, serositis, and hematologic flares. And remember, when we throw around that word serositis, that's just talking about inflammation from lupus related to the covering around the heart, around the lungs, and possibly around the tummy. So air pollution definitely associated with lupus disease flares. Now, one positive study, and this was like noted in a couple of different reviews. So it must have been studied years ago, but basically hair dye, lipstick, many studies, no association. I know there's going to be people who are happy out there about that one. So moving on to vices. So alcohol and tobacco. So alcohol, actually, I was surprised to find when I was doing the digging that moderate wine usage actually has a protection against lupus development. However, with that caveat, there comes a caveat that lupus can interact with many, many lupus medications. And so there's always the importance to use caution. Now, cigarettes, this is one that is essentially like air pollution right in your face. This one we know for sure cigarettes cause an increased risk of developing lupus as well as lupus flares. And there's a particularly strong association with developing lupus rashes. And this is really hard to delineate. What is it about the cigarettes? Cigarettes are not, they're not just a single chemical. They are basically combustion of organic material that results in lots of yucky things. So there's tars, there's the nicotine itself, there's the carbon monoxide exposure, there's aromatic hydrocarbons, et cetera. And so in general, it's just very simple. Don't smoke. Smoking not only increases your risk of lupus and lupus disease activity, but also increases cardiovascular disease. And so in general, this is a quote from the Lupus Foundation website that was for a couple of years ago, but it's definitely still true. The more than any other lifestyle choice you make, quitting cigarettes has the greatest positive impact on lupus. So what about other stuff? So smoking the other stuff that is I think this is a national presentation, so depending on your state, may or may not be recreationally or medically approved in your state, but we're talking about medical marijuana, recreational marijuana, CBD, or THC. So those are both the things that are in marijuana. So there's a lot of interest in this topic, basically for a variety of reasons, but lots of changes in governmental regulations in the last several years, particularly related to increase in use for both recreational and medical uses of both marijuana and its byproducts. This is very challenging to find studies regarding this because it's still very early in the infancy of what we understand about these products. In general, marijuana is still considered a Schedule I drug. And so in order to actually study this medication, these products, it's extremely highly regulated. Some studies, though, that I did want to point out, there are possible side effects that were at least noted in one dermatologic paper. Urticaria and pruritus, so that's like an itchy allergic type rash, as well as cannabis arteritis, so that's inflammation within the blood vessels that can present with necrosis and tissue gangrene, as well as ulcers, and then oral cancers are definitely associated with cannabis smoke. So that's like marijuana smoking. I also wanted to point out that there are differences in FDA regulated products and OTC supplements, so over-the-counter supplements. So when the government gets involved and the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, is involved, there's a highly regulated process where, for example, let's take Plaquenil. We know kind of you have to have the certain amount of Plaquenil in the pill. And so when a person says, yes, I'm taking Plaquenil, we can all agree on what is in the pill and what you're being exposed to. In contrast, something that's an OTC supplement, so an over-the-counter supplement, like here, at least in Ohio, you can get CBD, so the non-THC form of marijuana, in a lot of over-the-counter like creams and oils and things like that. Over-the-counter supplements are not FDA regulated, and so you can never really know how much and how well refined what you're actually getting. And this kind of actually applies to even like vitamins and supplements. So very, very difficult, but lots more coming. Now moving on to infections. So there's many proposed infections that have been related to both lupus development as well as lupus flares, but very few with evidence. The most strongest data that we have is on the EBV, or Epstein-Barr virus. And we know from many studies that lupus patients are more likely to have EBV antibodies, which show prior infection. But remember, there's the caveat that association does not prove causation. This is just too common an infection to basically blame this little virus. Almost all types of infections have been noted to cause flares. So the common cold, flu, COVID, pneumonia, UTI, et cetera, et cetera. They're all anything that really upsets the equilibrium, the homeostasis of the body, can tip the balance of lupus quiet remission into lupus high disease activity. Now, vaccines, there are a few cases reported in the literature that flares are caused by a vaccine, but as I said, this is extremely rare. And in general, vaccines are one of the things that you can do to protect yourself as a lupus patient, because we know that infections can tip over that balance. Other things you can do with regard to protecting yourself from infections, so limiting sick exposure, hand hygiene, masking when appropriate, which everyone I'm sure is still doing, and then being proactive when you're ill. So resting, calling your physician sooner rather than later, depending on medications, holding immunosuppression when there's a fever or even early sick symptoms, just to be safe. Now moving on to more general environmental topics. So the sun, vitamin D, weather. So sun exposure, very clear evidence for flares, both skin and other types of flares. And I don't go into a whole lot more other details other than the sun is the glaring thing in the environment that we know, other than cigarettes, is very strongly linked. Now, vitamin D, which we know is actually it's a hormone, it's not a vitamin, that your body makes in the skin in response to sun. So vitamin D, there's a link between vitamin D deficiency and lupus development, as well as lupus activity. So low vitamin D leading to starting lupus, as well as low vitamin D leading to lupus disease activity. This is potentially a chicken and egg phenomenon, and it's a little bit hard to explain because we think about vitamin D deficiency as if it's like a wallet. Like if you don't have enough, that's it. That's your vitamin D deficient, and you need to fill your wallet with more vitamin D, and you're done. But actually, your body uses vitamin D as a marker of inflammation. And so when your vitamin D level is low, that actually can suggest that there's high levels of inflammation. And so it might not actually be a true vitamin D deficiency. So it's a little bit of a difficult thing to explain, but there's definitely some suggestion that low vitamin D can lead to lupus flares as well as to lupus development itself. Now, something a little more complicated to explain, but something that also came out of that Johns Hopkins study, the geomagnetic disturbances. So that's like the magnetic forces around the Earth, particularly in relation to its spinning axis and in relation to the sun. So those disturbances, including levels of geomagnetic activity, the number of sunspots, and high proton flux events may influence lupus disease activity. So things that we're not going to necessarily change about our environment, but that we know things in the environment do have that effect on lupus. Other things, so seasonal variation, so not particularly well studied, but I found a couple that were kind of interesting. So one study in a city in northern Norway. So you can imagine that their winters have very, very short days where they have very, very little sunlight and very, very cold weather, and then very, very long summer days. That study showed no major seasonal variation, where in the winter they're only getting 5 hours of daylight. To me, that was a little bit surprising, but then there was a Baltimore study that did show the skin and joint activity in lupus patients is increased during the spring and summer months, as we would expect, right? So more sun exposure. We know the sun is the biggest trigger. And so not surprising. Other organs other than the skin and joint did have different patterns, as we'll see on the next slide, I think. But yeah, like I said, the seasonal variation, this is something that's definitely hard to tease out, whether from ultraviolet light exposure, from infections, right? Here in the north, it's, like I said, 3 feet of snow outside. We're all kind of clustered inside. So is it the weather, or is it because we're shedding all of our cold infections and things like that? And so it's the infections that's causing it. So a little bit hard to tease out. When we do find, there's a couple of studies kind of focusing on weather alone. I think more from that Johns Hopkins cohort. So increases in temperature were generally associated with increases in renal, skin, and as well as blood and serositis flares, as well as increases in humidity associated with joint and serositis flares. Another one here, sort of same idea, fine particulate matter concentration significantly associated with all types of lupus flares. Ozone concentration, so remember this is basically the covering around the Earth that is protecting us from harmful radiation from the sun. So as the ozone concentration is directly associated with renal flares. So that's kind of interesting. And then barometric pressure. which kind of, remember, goes up and down depending on whether it's raining, snowing, high pressure, kind of moving in, things like that, basically had no significant association with lupus disease flares. So regarding weather and our sort of very external environment, what can we do? So sunblock. So remember, sun is the most important thing. So sun exposure, so minimizing that by using long sleeves, sun blocking clothing, hats, limiting sun exposure, particularly avoiding the high sun beams during the summer. So like that 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. When there's the most intense sun, and then vitamin D supplementation. So there's the rule of thumb is for, if you're not going to take a supplement, you need at least 15 minutes of sunblocked skin exposure. So sort of just like in short sleeves, 15 minutes twice a week. And that, I would say, is not recommended for lupus patients, that it's better to just go for the supplement because we know that that sun exposure can cause the lupus flare. So vitamin D supplement, also good for your bones. Now there's the non-tangible environment. And so here I just sort of like put it all the other stuff that you can't really touch, right? So the stress, call it stress, which, we talk about stress and we think about it as like it's my finances, my work environment, my washing machine broke, things like that. And all those things, both the physical stress, mental stress, can actually worsen immune system responses. And it's been documented many, many different ways. And so these are definitely things to work on, right? So think about this list that I have here: physical and mental stress, sleep deprivation, deconditioning. So just being out of shape, where your body could maybe be in a better place, and that can optimize your immune system. Job stress may or may not be, something that you can easily change. Difficult finances, major changes in life, like deaths, divorces, abusive relationships, moving, general burnout. Speaking of burnout, which is kind of part of this whole topic, there's a great book by Emily Nagoski and her sister, another Nagoski, and the book is basically titled Burnout, and it's an excellent discussion on for the layperson on the physical effects of both mental and emotional stress, titling Burnout. So I highly recommend it. So what are some things you can do about it? You can't easily fix difficult finances. You can't easily get over a divorce, but there are things that you can do for your own wellness that help with that kind of your body's response. So working on exercise, working as much as possible to get adequate sleep, meditating, personal connections. So connecting with friends, doing this, sort of getting in contact with community. So like the Lupus Foundation, where you're connecting with people. I saw people in the chat saying, good to see you. And that's great. Connecting with other people who are going through things like you are. Working on self-care and self-compassion and being gentle and kind to yourself. There are things that are hard to do, but are better with practice. Now, climate change, I'm going to say a word about it because I have a microphone and it definitely seems appropriate with today's topic. So we just made that point that pollution, ozone concentration, high sun exposure, high temperatures are all associated with worse lupus outcomes. And all of these are worse with climate change. So what are some things we can do? We can all do a little bit, right? Growing up, a child of the 80s and 90s, reduce, reuse, recycle. And we can all do a little bit of that. So moving toward using electric things rather than combustibles. I'm a big fan of thrift shops. Going and buying something new actually takes, if you think about buying a new pair of jeans, generally jeans have to be washed like 30 to 40 times in order to get that wear. Buying an old pair of jeans is actually better for the environment, right? Taking Tupperware and bags to the restaurant for leftovers. you don't see it often, but remember, what, I think there's that quote with that, I think Gandhi said it, be the change you want to see in the world. So I started doing that, taking Tupperware and recycled bags to a restaurant, and the waiters get used to saying, wow, I'm glad you have your own, and maybe other people will see you doing it and make it okay that we're all doing it. Using recycling shopping bags, which is obviously becoming more and more common use, driving electric if that's at all possible. And just remember that every little change helps. If you won't do it for yourself and for your friends with lupus, do it for your kids, do it for my kids. So to summarize, what are some things we can do? Very strong, don't smoke. If you are smoking, please stop. And if you are not smoking, please don't start, and discourage your friends from smoking. We didn't talk about it today, but hydroxychloroquine, so Plaquenil, take your hydroxychloroquine regularly. We know that has a very strong decrease in morbidity and mortality in lupus. Having a healthy diet, so lower fat, lower cholesterol diet, focusing on eating whole grains, vegetables, lean sources of protein, and then avoiding sun and using sunblock, which we're going to talk a little bit more in detail in the questions, and then being smart regarding vaccines, hand washing, being proactive while sick, and then self-care like exercise, adequate sleep, meditation, personal connection, self-care, self-compassion. All right. I'm going to assume Leslie is okay with me addressing these questions. I had a couple of questions that came through ahead of time, and so I prepared a couple of slides regarding these. They were very, very good questions, and I was glad that I had a couple of days to prepare some responses because they were very specific. So the first question was from a person that said, I have used sunscreens with oxybenzone, homosalate, and octinoxate. They have caused breakouts in an itchy rash. I have read these chemicals can interfere with hormones and may be toxic. Any comments? Are these sunscreens with zinc oxide or titanium dioxide the best alternatives? And so this is, I have a little website down here at the bottom. It's from the American, I think, Academy of Dermatology that kind of did a really nice job explaining that the FDA is actually doing a lot of investigation into sunblocks. And so there's sort of two categories. There's actually three categories. So the first category is the GRASE category, GRASE. These are generally recognized as safe and effective. And there are two ingredients in that category, and that's titanium dioxide and zinc oxide. These are both physical sunscreens. So they are actual minerals that act as a shield. And so these have actually both been recognized as safe and effective. They are not absorbed into the skin. Now, there is a whole long list that there's a list that is also used in Canada and Europe, but I'm just putting here the list that's under investigation in the United States. And it includes a whole bunch of words, the chemicals that are very long, but include the three that the person who asked the question. And so I wanted to point those out. And these in general are chemical sunscreens. And so they work like a sponge where they absorb the sun's rays. They're easier to rub into the skin and don't leave a white residue. So the other three that the question asker suggested, those are still under investigation. And they are actually, according to an environmental working group, which is an American group, suggest that they have some weak hormonal effects and some allergy concerns. Now, I tried to do a little bit more research in like the scientific literature, and this is extremely complicated. I mean, I'm a chemist by trade before I became a physician, and just looking up, oxybenzone and lupus, or oxybenzone and hormonal effects, it would potentially take days to understand this and learn this. So I'm going to take what I learned from that website, the environmental working group, to suggest that yes, there is some potential weak hormonal effects, and that if there are concerns, which there are concerns in a lupus patient with looking at chemicals that potentially have hormonal effects, because we know hormones play an important role in lupus. And so really, to answer the question, yes, the zinc or titanium-based sunscreens are the best alternatives. Even though they turn your skin white, they are definitely the best because of the lack of absorption, I think. Now, the next question was, I have read that there's an association between pollution and heart disease. Can you comment on this? And so I went and found there was a study, it was a little more than 10 years ago, just a review article, but that definitely commented that particulate matter in air pollution is associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular morbidity mortality. And remember, when we use those big M's, the morbidity mortality, we're talking about disease that doesn't hurt you, morbidity, and then mortality, disease that can kill you. And the same review suggested that there's evidence that even short-term exposure to high concentrations of PM 2.5 over a few hours can trigger myocardial infarctions, so heart attacks, cardiac ischemia, so death to your heart tissue, arrhythmias, which would be funny heart rhythms, heart failure, where your heart is not pumping as well as it should, strokes, exacerbation of bad circulation, peripheral artery disease, as well as sudden death. So pollution, climate change, they definitely have a link to affect lupus, and they definitely have that link to heart disease, which we know lupus patients are disproportionately affected by. Now, the next question is tricky. The next question was mentioning the idea that I had talked about EBV and antibodies that are higher in lupus patients, but as I said, association does not prove causation. So is there an association with the EBV viral load and lupus? And so I found a Korean study, 2004, that suggested, very small, but 24 lupus patients versus 29 controls, and basically looked at EBV loads, so meaning the viral loads and how much was stuck in their blood cells. And so the number of infections and the type of infections, because there are different subtypes of EBV, were quite similar between the control population and the lupus population. However, this was really, really interesting. The burden of EBV, so the viral load in the peripheral mononuclear, so those are like the macrophages that are floating around, they are over 15-fold greater in lupus patients than in a healthy person, basically suggesting that EBV infection might be abnormally regulated in lupus patients. And so again, that does not prove anything like causation, but it suggests that potentially that is a very strong trigger in that two-hit hypothesis. They also made a comment that the abnormally increased proportion of EBV infected B cells in lupus patients might contribute to that enhanced autoimmune production, autoantibody production in this disease. Now, the next question was, have there been any studies or reports that show the carbon footprint related to care of lupus patients? I could not find anything in the literature. I will confess, I looked in things like PubMed, which are like the medical literature. I'm not sure how to look in the environmental literature, but my educated guess is that it's probably a little bit slightly higher than usual care, basically because of cost of, what did I mean by cost of pollutants? I'm not sure what I meant. Basically, cost of medications, sorry, that was my error right there. Traveling while researching and developing medications and then transporting medications. So just if you have to think about like, let's say like all the, all the cost of combustion of things that go into making something like the new medications that are out for lupus. Obviously, there's travel, sending PhDs around the world and things like that. That's going to cost a little bit. And so if you split that among all the lupus patients, probably just becomes a little bit higher than the general population. And the last prefab question we had was, can well water be a trigger for a lupus flare? And so I had to kind of do a little research on what makes well water versus what makes tap water. So well water basically comes from pockets of water deep in the ground and is not treated like tap water. And so this is going to vary by location. So, for example, I saw out in the chat, someone from Houston, is going to have obviously very different well water than what we have here in Northern Ohio. In general, well water tends to have higher concentrations of magnesium and calcium content and higher other mineral content. And in general, they're not treated with things like fluoride. So that's important, very, very important for teeth. So I did find one 1992 study that looked at exposure of, I'm not going to try to pronounce these, trichloroethylene and trichloroethane, et cetera, chemicals in water obtained from wells in Arizona. And basically this one study in this, again, a very small area, showed long-term exposure to these chemicals in contaminated well water significantly increase symptoms of lupus in that population. So this is kind of just serves as a general example that, this kind of question where we're looking at well water, it's not going to, we probably are never going to have a good answer for all lupus patients around the world. You would only be able to sort of look at a particularly small area and maybe study. Remember, lupus affects less than 1% of every population. So, in order to get a strong statistical effect, you have to have a large enough area. And so sometimes I think with questions like this, we're not going to ever have a really good answer. All right. That's all I have pre-prepared. So I'm going to.
Yeah. Lots of questions rolling in, Dr. Antonelli, and thank you so much for your presentation. Lots of eye-opening things. Some people saying, oh, I never knew dogs could get lupus. And so, yeah, a couple comments in there, and I don't know if you can see any of those comments that you want to try and take a stab at. I'm happy to help.
I am. Dog lupus is, I would say dog lupus is a very interesting thing for lupus patients to think about. It is, there's actually like a theory out there about how lupus develops in humans, very similar to why we think dogs develop lupus. So, all right, I'm going to try to weed out a question here. So let's see.
So 2 good things I learned, Dr. Antonelli: lipstick, because that's my superpower. So that's good. Not anything that'll cause anything. And then moderate wine usage.
Yes.
So we can all have a glass of wine responsibly. I saw someone in there saying, is beer okay? I don't know.
Yeah. That's hard. I mean, remember when there's a scientific study that says wine in moderate use is okay, in general, what they're doing is they're asking a group of patients, okay, in the last 5 years, how often did you drink beer? How often did you drink wine? How often did you drink distilled spirits? And so they probably teased it out, and I probably missed it. But in general, I would have to comment that when we're studying things like wine, you generally don't extrapolate that to be alcoholic benefit. Like, well, it must be the alcohol. In general, there's a lot of data that shows that red wine in particular has that benefit. And because there's a lot of other good things that are in red wine, things like tannins and other stuff that I don't remember. And so that's why you never hear those sort of like, ooh, alcohol in moderation in general is good for heart disease. No, it's like red wine is in general. So I don't know if there's data out there about beer, but in general, in moderation, a glass of beer is probably okay. Again, like I said, with that caveat that all alcohol can interact with lupus medications.
Right. So someone else was asking about EBV virus, the Epstein-Barr virus. Mm-hmm. Someone just wanted clarification.
Here's a good question. From Ellen, what is the recommended amount of vitamin D? So I think the recommended amount is between 400 IU and 2000 IU daily. But I would say, and again, this is a personal preference and just my general treatment with patients, that's what has been recommended by large groups, saying this is probably good for the majority of the population. But when we start to look at vitamin D, and you start to say, well, what is adequate when you test a vitamin D level? For example, testing vitamin D level here in Cleveland, it's so rare to get like a normal level because we get so little sun and because so few adults take vitamin D in their diet. Most adults don't really get good dairy products that have that vitamin D fortification. And so really it has to be very individualized, that a person who is like lactose intolerant, doesn't get vitamin D in their diet, doesn't go outside a lot, uses a lot of sunblock, that person is going to need maybe 5,000 IU international units a day versus someone who gets 3 units of dairy a day, takes, goes for walks and is able to go without sunblock. And that person may only need 400, if anything at all. So, all right, I hope that answers your question, Ellen.
Dr. Antonelli, in the Q&A section, it seems like there's some really good questions in there as well. If you want to take a gander over there, someone's asking about diet and nightshade as being a trigger, nightshades as being a trigger. Diet's really tricky, so I know you touched base upon that.
I am going to defer the question about nightshades because I don't know what that is. So I'm going to skip that one. Let's see. Oh, wow. These are so many good questions. See, these are questions we need to have Leslie, we need to have a session that's just question and answer, but they need to be prefab so I can go and research them, because some of these are very, very challenging. Okay, so this one, like, can secondhand marijuana smoke cause urticaria or pruritus? So yes, I mean, I don't have the data, but can any secondhand exposure to combustion? So remember, when a person is smoking, whether it's a cigarette or something else, there's combustion of a product. And so you're going to get cyclized things, and you can definitely inhale that. And your body creates an immune response, allergic type. So definitely urticaria, pruritus, definitely. See if I can keep going there.
So we also want to keep questions pretty general. So when we're talking about treatment with, options, the best solution is, or best person to talk to is your physician. So I see a lot of comments in here that maybe are particularly pertaining to each individual person.
Right.
And sometimes we do have to fact check a little bit. We got some really interesting questions here about like bottled water and tap water. And you did a really great presentation on the well water there.
So one thing about bottled water and tap water. So bottled water is somewhat treated that it has less chemicals in it than tap water. So tap water is treated to be safer and potable drinking water. Some bottled water is distilled water where there's like nothing in there. And actually there are some medications, and not the lupus medications that I can think of, that you're not supposed to take with that. So actually that's a really important point, that, if you are drinking just bottled water, like if you're in an area where, the tap water is not very doesn't taste good to you, and you really only stick with like bottled water, that would be something that would be really important to talk with your physician about, because there are some medications that the absorption is changed by drinking certain types of bottled water.
That's interesting.
I want to point out this one question because I think this is really important. Somebody asked, I smoke tobacco it's so hard not to use tobacco. Any recommendations? And I think that's like a really, you know, we talk about it flippantly, you know, just don't smoke. But tobacco is probably the most addictive thing that we have on the market, that is legal. And there are many ways, at least I can tell you in Ohio, and that's why it's so hard. This is national. We have an Ohio quit line that is like a 1-800 number where you can call. It's 24/7. There's like a nurse on call. There's free patches, free gums, lozenges. In general, it's such a mental addiction. You know, we have a lot of medications that can help patients quit this addictive product, but it really comes down to if you're smoking, let's say, you know, a pack plus a day, cutting down slowly, setting a quit date, getting down to, if you can, 5 cigarettes a day or less. 5 cigarettes a day is that cutoff where you say 5 or less becomes a mental addiction and not the physical addiction. Whereas if you're smoking more than 5 cigarettes a day, there's still a very high physical withdrawal when you stop. And then, you know, if you set a quit date and you make it a couple of days or even a couple of weeks and then go back to it, to not give up. There's a lot of studies that say the more attempts at quitting, the more likely you are to stop. So somebody who only tried once is more likely to fail, but somebody who tried 15 times or 20 times is much more likely to stick with it. And so just, you know, acknowledge that this is, you know, we live in a world where the advertising gets to us, and our society, it's more and more acceptable to be a non-smoker. And it's harder and harder to continue to be a smoker. And I think that's, you know, we're making good strides, but kudos to everyone out there who's trying. You can do it.
So keep at it. Whoever asked that question, you know, it's not easy, but it's
not easy.
You can do
it.
And I didn't know about the free Ohio quit smoke line, so I'm going to look into that for sure. So that's great. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah. Okay, I want to answer, because this is a really good kind of general question. So an anonymous attendee, how specifically do these factors like UV light, smoke trigger autoimmunity? And so it's the basic idea that UV light and smoke in particular, they basically expose your body to something that is not normal. And so your body, the DNA kind of gets messed up. So, you know, when you have a baby and the baby is perfect, the DNA replication happens. Right now, it happens in the beginning, it happens perfectly, that, you know, you're making a clone of that DNA and the little cell replicates itself again and again and again, and it's perfect. But now you take that baby out in the sun, and the sun exposure, the sun radiation comes in, the UV light radiation comes in, and the body sees that radiation, and the radiation actually basically screws up the DNA to say, okay, this replication is not going to be perfect. And so now you've got a replication that is not so good. And sometimes it happens in, let's say, a cancer gene, and then that turns into cancer. And sometimes it happens in an an immune gene. So for example, let's say it's that macrophage, you know, the little genes in the macrophages, where the macrophages are supposed to be the little garbage pickers in your body. But now this macrophage gets infected with EBV, that Epstein-Barr virus, and that person who has that predisposed genetics from their parents to go on, you know, to fight that EBV infection, but potentially turns into something like lupus or some other autoimmune condition. So in general, these are things like the UV light, the smoke, potentially anything else. Basically, they alter the DNA so that DNA replication, or turn on genes that turn into autoimmunity, basically.
Thank you for that. So we have like a couple minutes left. Going back to like smoke and carcinogens and cigarettes, someone's asking about fireplace smoke. You know, is there a correlation there? kind of tough, but I know
So
specifically.
fireplace smoke would be like, it would be like air pollution, because if you think about anything that you're burning, basically is going to turn into carbon dioxide, and basically ash. And you can see the ash in the fireplace, but there's always extra little particles. And so this is, educated guess. I'm not sure that there's any studies out there like this, but for example, when I have treated patients who have come from like Asian populations where they have indoor cooking ranges and they don't have windows, they have actually very, very high rates of things like COPD and emphysema, because that smoke and combustion exposure in such close areas exposes the body to that the fluorocarbons and things that come out of that combustion. So I would assume that a fireplace exposure would be just like that, air pollution. So that would be something like, if at all possible, if you were choosing between houses and apartments where one had like a gas fireplace versus a wood burning fireplace, a gas fireplace has much less air pollution, and that debris that would come with wood burning fire versus gas fire, where you're literally in general, that's probably not as good as electric. Electric heat is going to be much cleaner, cleaner for the environment, because you can get it from now wind sources. But I guess that would be the general educated guess in preference, that electric over gas heat, like gas burning fireplace, and then gas burning fireplace over log burning fireplace. As cozy and wonderful as that sounds, it's worse for the environment and probably worse for lupus.
I loved your slide on helping out the environment, bringing Tupperware to a restaurant, and cutting back on that reduce, reuse, recycle. It was a great suggestion. I'll keep that in mind. I will. All right, we have 1 minute left here. Can we take a little quick view at back to diet and perhaps the correlation with too much sugar in the diet? That could cause other autoimmune diseases, but could you touch base upon that? And I think that might be the last question for the evening.
So sugar in general. So this is tricky, because sugar, when we use that word sugar, we are generally talking about sucrose, which is that table sugar, but there's many, many, many good sugars that are in diets. And I would just comment and say everything in moderation is okay. You don't want to have lots and lots of processed foods that have a lot of sugar. You want to have more kind of natural diet, but that little bit of ice cream at the end of the day, maybe once a week or something like that would be good for you, good for your mental health. But yeah, as far as table sugars and autoimmunity, I don't think I read about something like that, but I would say everything in moderation.
I agree. Moderation. We can all indulge just a little bit of ice cream, just not the whole Ben and Jerry's.
Not the whole Ben and Jerry's. No.
Well, we have lots of thank yous popping in. Everyone saying thank you so much, Dr. Antonelli. Thanks, Dr. Maria. And lots of well praises. And this was a very interesting topic. It is being recorded, so please contact your local chapter if you want to catch this on the replay, or maybe replay it for us. Lots of people saying very informative. And thank you so much, Dr. Antonelli, for taking the time to educate lupus patients across the states here. So it's really great when we can all get together on a forum like this, and we appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Leslie. Thanks to everyone for participating today.